you are, Judge Oldham. Well, welcome, hello, and welcome to everyone. This is Judgment Calls. I'm David Levy. I'm director of the Bolch Judicial Institute at Duke Law School. We are so fortunate today and for much of this week to have Judge Andrew Oldham from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. His chambers are in Austin, Texas. He's our distinguished judge in residence this month. He was appointed to the bench in 2018, and he's had a very distinguished career. He's done a lot in his, I would say, from my perspective, young life. Before his appointment, he had a varied career in government and private practice. He was General Counsel to the Governor of Texas. He served as the Deputy Solicitor General for the state of Texas. He was an attorney advisor in the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel. He was an appellate lawyer in private practice at one of the top DC law firms. He served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Alito, and to Judge, before that, he was a law clerk to Judge David Sentelle of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. He has a BA from the University of Virginia with highest honors. Virginia, you can't get everything right, Judge Oldham, but you came close. He has an MPhil first class from Cambridge University, which is quite a distinction, and he has a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School in 2005. So you've done a lot, Judge Oldham, in the 15 years since law school, and it's impressive, and we're very lucky to have your talents on the federal bench. So why don't we just start at the beginning? It's always a good place, as they say in The Sound of Music. You grew up in Richmond, Virginia. What kind of growing up did you have?
Oh gosh. Well, first, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such a joy to be able to participate in the program and to visit with the law school community. I'm only grieved that I can't be there with you in person, but I'm still nonetheless humbled and honored by the chance to visit. So I was born in Richmond, Virginia, although I didn't really spend much time there. My parents moved when I was 2, and I spent most of my childhood in Lynchburg, Virginia, about 2.5 hours to the west. Both my parents are doctors. I have no lawyers, as far as I know, in my family on either side. And my childhood was incredible. My parents are the two of the most loving, humble servants I've ever met in my life. My dad worked really, really, really hard when I was a kid, and I didn't get to see a lot of him because he was busy building his practice and putting food on the table. Both of them came from incredibly humble backgrounds. My dad was born in a trailer. My mother was raised by a single mom. My grandmother was a single mom who was with a high school education and a typist for a construction company. So they were both really, really came from modest backgrounds. And so I think they both worked really, really hard when I was a kid to try to build a better life for us.
Remarkable people. You know, I'm struck. Our last judge in residence, distinguished judge, was Leandra Kruger from the California Supreme Court, and her parents were both doctors as well. And you know, often when both parents are doctors, you imagine the kids will be doctors because that's the world they know, and not lawyers, because sometimes doctors aren't all that keen on lawyers for the obvious reasons. Did you ever consider going into medicine?
Oh yes. So I'll tell you 2 stories. One, I was pre-med at the University of Virginia my first couple of years there. I had every intention of going to medical school because that's what we do. And my siblings did that, and I'm the oldest of 4. So I was both the first to stray and also the proverbial black sheep because I was the only to stray from this path. And so I absolutely had every intention of doing it, and I would have probably done it, but for the fact that I took an Econ 201 class at the University of Virginia and fell in love with the professor, Ken Elzinga, who forever changed my life. He co-taught antitrust economics at the law school. Or I should say he taught antitrust economics at the law school, was co-listed at the law school. And he just took me under his wing, and we started talking about law and economics, and in particular antitrust, and I just fell in love with it. And I thought, you know what? organic chemistry, in a particular organic chemistry lab, I was like, ugh. The math didn't bother me. It was all of the like practical stuff of the, cleaning your autoclaves and all that nonsense. I couldn't do it. And so that's how I ended up there. And I will never forget that. The second story, I will never forget, I was in graduate school in England. And this is back in the old days when we had those transatlantic calling cards, right? At least I didn't have enough money to have one of those transatlantic cell phones 100 years ago. So when I would want to talk to my parents, I would get one of those little cards at the convenience store, and you dial the whatever 25 digits, and you had a prepaid amount of money on it. You could call and talk. And I always got the cheapest ones because I had no money. And so I had this really cheap transatlantic calling card, and I dialed it frantically. I called my mom. Mom, I just got into Harvard. I'm going to go to law school. I was so excited. And I thought the call dropped because on the other end, it was just complete radio silence from my doctor, who was sitting there with my doctor dad. And after a while, I was like, Mom, are you there? Are you there? And I could hear her sobbing. And I was like, oh, Mom, that's so sweet. Because she's not a very emotional woman. I didn't really think she'd be that happy about it. And she's like, no, I'm not happy. I'm quite sad because, one day I'm going to see my son chasing ambulances and suing doctors. And so she got over it eventually. But
so let's talk about that time in Cambridge, because that's not it's not unusual, but it's not typical either. Were you thinking you might have an academic career, and you had a Truman Scholarship that paid for this? What did you study, and how did this fit?
Yeah, so I studied primarily economics, and I was thinking at the time, I wasn't convinced I wanted to go to law school. What I really thought I wanted to do is I wanted to do antitrust. I loved antitrust. So that was the most fascinating topic in law school. I had such a great time. I worked for one of the great honors of my time there. I got to RA for Louis Kaplow, who was at the time in charge of the Arita treatise. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. Every new case is, you get to learn a new industry. It's incredibly practical, yet intellectually stimulating. It's got a statutory background, but a lot of common law to it. And so and obviously a lot of it is highly formal economics. And so I was interested in perhaps being an antitrust expert, getting a PhD maybe in economics, doing that route of the discipline. And I got to graduate school and I thought, man, I'm not sure I can do, 7 years in the library. I love the library, but 7 years, a lot of years in the library. And so I would be sort of flirting with the idea of maybe, applying to, a program like MIT or something to do economics. And my little brief stint in Cambridge was enough to convince me that I like people too much. I like being on my feet too much. I like talking too much. I like the intellectual engagement of something other than just pouring your heart and soul into a single paper in a dissertation. So,
but a very worthwhile time for you. So because of the focus on economics and your interest in antitrust, I imagine it gave you a leg up when you went to law school.
No doubt. And in particular, I think having just a little bit of space between undergrad and law school, I think having just a slight separation, understanding a little bit about graduate school, even if it's on 3,000 miles away, I think was definitely a huge advantage. And it really convinced me that I actually really desperately wanted to be in law school, that was the real place that God had for me in this world. Whereas I know a lot of people sometimes, struggle with, well, I end up in law school by default, right? Or I end up in law school because my dad is a lawyer or what have you. I think I took the time and was really convinced that I wanted to be there. And so I think that was a huge advantage.
So you do well in law school and you graduated in 2005, and then you had 2 clerkships, and both of the judges that you clerked for have Duke connections because Justice Alito's son, Philip, was a graduate of Duke Law School, and Justice Alito has done quite a bit of teaching at Duke. And Judge David Sentelle is a North Carolinian. He went to UNC. We can't fault him for that, but he was on the Board of Visitors of the Duke Law School for a long time. It's hired many of our graduates. And of course he can sing the entire Johnny Cash repertoire. So they're both remarkable people, and that must have been great.
Oh, it was incredible. I will never. I mean, those 2 men and the impact that they've had on my life is indescribable with words in the English language. I mean, and not just because of where I am now. Just, yeah, I would have said the same thing 5 years ago. The way they approach their jobs, the way they approach their families, the way they think about the law, the way they think about American history, English history. They're just deep, rich, profound understandings of the rule of law. I find both of them such inspirations. I often tell my law clerks at the beginning of our terms together that, I hope that one day I will be, a 10th of the man and a 10th of the judge that those two are. And that if I can make their clerkship experiences a millionth as valuable as mine was, that I will have considered the year a success. Because they just forever changed my life, touched my heart, inspired me. Every single day, I was just thrilled to be in the office with them, have a chance to learn from them. They were amazing.
Well, they must be so proud of you as well. Do you continue to have contact with them from time to time?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the great things about being on the Fifth Circuit is Justice Alito is now our circuit justice. And so I used to refer to him as my boss, but now he's like my boss in multiple ways. It's kind of, it's kind of neat. So yeah, it's wonderful to be able to talk to him about things related to work and not related to work, right? It's a whole new level of relationship. And the same with Judge Sentelle. I still call Judge Sentelle from time to time. Often it's to say, hey, I had this case that involved whatever provision of whatever application of the APA. It made me think of our time together. You might see I cited this opinion. Look at this, that you may recall from our time together. And it's a wonderful feeling of the kind of the connection of our lives, how closely they've been sort of interwoven. It's just, I don't know. I feel like it has only enriched my relationship with both of them, that I was already completely enamored of them.
So you may have other judicial role models, I don't know, but it's one of the questions that I often ask on the Judgment Calls program is whether there is a judge or a group of judges who you take as a model and who you sort of ask, what would they do or how would they handle this situation? Or am I sort of living up to what I most respect in those judges? Is it fair to say they play that role, and maybe there are others as well?
Easily. And I ask myself that question all the time about how they would approach these things. I think it's one of the really neat things about clerking and a bunch of this other, just listening to you in the introduction, I was just thinking, my Lord, how have I been so blessed to be able to have this many different opportunities, work with these great many people. But I often will think, about the times like when you're on the staff side, whether you're a law clerk or a staffer to an official or whatever, you get to see what a lot of people in the public don't see. You get to see the moments of private wrestling. You get to see the way someone reasons through a problem. You get to see what genuine integrity looks like. And I just find it to be a constant reminder of what the public expects of us. I think, both of my bosses, both my judicial bosses, and this constant understanding that we are public servants, right? We are supported by the taxpayers. We are charged with an amazing public office of public trust, as I know from your former life. And we are given this incredible opportunity to exercise the judicial power of the United States. And with that comes the amazing responsibility of doing it with humility, of doing it with an understanding of the limits, both of us as human beings and the institution of law. And I constantly think about watching them wrestle with these sorts of problems because some of our cases are straightforward, but a lot of them aren't. And it gives rise to a lot of internal dialogue. Well,
I'm chair of the clerkship committee this year at the law school. So let me just put in a plug to the students who are listening. If you really should consider the clerking opportunity for all the reasons that Judge Oldham has said. And you said one thing, which I've heard from so many clerks, and I think I felt in the same way because I clerked for 2 judges as well, is that when you clerk, just as you come out of law school, it's a time in life where this may be, for many people, their first serious employment, at least in the law. And these judges often have a perspective on, which is a demanding profession, on how to live fully in the law without giving up on every other part of life. and, how to build a life in the law. And I think judges, they have that kind of relationship with their clerks that goes beyond just the analytic tools and the sort of philosophical approach, but more almost like you're part of their family.
Yeah, I refer to my clerks as my family constantly. In emails and conversation, and I don't mean it as a rhetorical trope. I mean it as a genuine, heartfelt feeling. For the year that we're together, we have this unbelievable bond because we get to work on things that other people don't get to see, and we get to talk about these very issues that you're just talking about. How do we do this with our families? How do we do this with other priorities that we have outside of the office? And you have a chance. You're not billing time by 6-minute increments. You don't have clients who are clamoring and, calling you at all hours of the night. And so I think it naturally gives rise to a period of reflection. And I think you're totally right that doing it right out of law school is a huge advantage because it provides you some form of foundation as you're proceeding forward in your career. And you can always think back to, I remember that there was a time when I wasn't taking client phone calls at midnight or whatever it is that you have to do.
Right. So you clerked. That was great. And then you went to the Office of Legal Counsel, it seems. Can you talk about that experience a little bit? That's very rare air in the Department of Justice.
I know. I find it it's so humbling, and it feels almost like I'm describing someone else's life. I'm telling you about something I read in a book because I still can't believe it actually happened. But one of my dearest professors and now the dean of Harvard Law School, but at the time was with my wonderful professor and mentor, John Manning, had done a similar sort of thing. And I didn't at the time have any particular ambition to use it for any particular thing. I was actually thinking when I was with Judge Sentelle, I was thinking, I'll just go to a law firm. I was young, unmarried, no families, blessed to have no debt. And I thought, this will be great. I'll, go to a law firm and make a little bit of money. And John Manning told me, well, listen, these sorts of jobs, these kinds of government opportunities, especially for young lawyers, they're not always open, right? Sometimes there's a hiring freeze. Sometimes the environment in the office or outside of it is such that you can't get a job there. So if you have an opportunity to go to a place like OLC, you would be an idiot. And those are my words, not his, not to do it. But that was the gestalt of the comment. And I said, okay, well, then I guess I'm going to OLC. And it was one of the smartest decisions I ever made because, I was 26 or something like that. And as you know, I mean, these OLC attorneys are involved in some of the most intimately important, high profile, sensitive matters of national security, all sorts of stuff that, quite frankly, I still can't understand how you would let a 26-year-old, kid into that sort of role. But my goodness, it was awesome. And every single day I would have a list of whatever 6 things I was supposed to do that day. And I would go to the office and I would do 26 things, not a single one of which was those 6. And it was just awesome. And I learned a ton.
And that office is sort of court-like, as I understand it, because it has its own internal precedent, which you tend to follow from administration to administration. It has a certain kind of internal integrity, I'll call it, or consistency.
That's absolutely right. I won't try to turn my computer around to show it to you but I do have the bound volumes of the OLC opinions. They write opinions a lot like courts, and they're in leather-bound books with volume numbers, and we cite them, or OLC would cite them as the same way a court would cite them as an opinion. In some of the most interesting things, especially for those of us who think a lot about justiciability doctrines and the limits on federal courts, some of the most interesting legal disputes don't ever get into federal court because of the limited nature of federal jurisdiction. And so I remember having this amazing OLC issue that involved some pirate ship that was seized off the coast of Miami. It was wild, but for whatever reason, it wasn't in federal court. It was some dispute that we had gotten involved in. And it's just really kind of it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And you learn a totally different perspective that if you just do litigation or transactional work or the kinds of stuff that is like 99% of what lawyers think about, you don't really get a chance to engage in these kinds of issues. It's much closer, I think, to academia in that sense, because you're sort of emancipated from the need to, be bound down by courts and doctrines and the federal rules of civil procedure, such as they are.
Yeah, well, they're pretty good. So then you left the government and you became what I'm going to call a DC lawyer. You went to one of the top firms and you had an appellate practice, and that's kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I had every intention, I think, if I can recall it correctly, at the time of staying in Washington. I sort of thought, as you mentioned, I'm from Virginia. My folks still live in Virginia. I'd always sort of thought of myself as a Virginian, and I thought, I'll live in Northern Virginia. And this is obviously, the DC lawyer it's an archetype, right? You can, take stints in government service. You can come out and go into private practice. Maybe you go in-house for a couple of years if your family requires it, or whatever it is. But it's a very well understood, well-trod path, and one that, I had every intention, at least as I recall, of following it. And I was very, very lucky to get to work at Kellogg. I still call it Kellogg Huber. It's now Kellogg Hansen. Different. They've changed the name, but the Kellogg law firm in Washington, and so yeah, that was certainly my intention at the time.
And so you did that for a number of years, and then maybe it wasn't as big a lightning bolt as put you on the circuit, but you certainly changed direction, and you left DC, you went to Texas, and you became the Deputy Solicitor General. So there must be a story there.
Oh gosh, is it? Yeah. So my years in private practice were just incredibly influential, in the sense I learned so much, especially at a firm like that. There's so many different cases, so many different issues, and so many smart people that you just are constantly, drinking out of the fire hose, right? It's sort of like being in Ernie Young's Fed Courts class, but for 7 days a week, around the clock or whatever, or as long as the workday would be. And because it's just constant flow of information and learning something new at every turn. But one of the things that I realized, as I was at that firm, is that, and this is what I meant earlier when I was saying, clerking right out of law school, you get a sense of perspective about what legal practice can be. I'd already seen a couple of different things, including being in the government, as you mentioned. And one of the things that really hit me is that I am happiest, and I realized this at some point when I was there, when I'm going to work in a building that has a flag on the roof, right? There's something about the public service of it that really, it fills my heart. I feel like there's a purpose, there's a mission, there are people who don't have voices for whom you can advocate. There is a public spiritedness to it that I just got a huge joy out of. Which is not to say anything about taking away from private practice. There's no way I could have ever done what I did in my time here in Texas, or really anything, without having that private practice experience. I mean, there's just so much you need to know that you can't learn, I think, without actually being there and doing it yourself. But I just realized that the thing that really is going to fill me up and give me that sense of purpose and calling was public service. And so I remember I was driving home one night, or I guess riding home one night, and I got a phone call just completely out of the blue from the Attorney General's office, and they said, "So I hear you love Texas," and I'd always had an affinity for Texas. I remember when I was clerking for Justice Alito, we were all sort of sitting around at the end of my three co-clerks and I were sitting around with the justice, and we were sort of talking about the year to come. He was giving us a hard time about how high the Supreme Court bonuses are, which of course is silly in hindsight, because now they're twice as high as they were then. And so we were all kind of joking about that. And he said, "So where are you guys going to be in 5 years?" And I said, "I don't know, but I'm going to be in Texas." And Justice Alito laughed at me. He's like, he's from New Jersey, doesn't understand. Why in the world? Why would you do that? And of course I was wearing my Lucchese boots when we were having the conversation. And so it wasn't that weird to want to be, but I've always had sort of a fondness and an affinity for the state, but I never really had an excuse to go. And I got this phone call one day, just totally out of the blue. And he said, "So I hear would you be open, to selling all of your things and moving 1,500 miles away to the sovereign land of Texas?" And I said, "Yeah, actually, I think I'm open to it." So we talked about it. I talked about it with the Attorney General for a couple months and tried to figure out if it was going to make sense. And I I realized that it was this kind of the opportunity. I felt like it was God opening a door that I had no idea. Like I certainly didn't knock on it, right? It wasn't like I was applying for something or seeking the opportunity. But once the door was open, it was just so transparent to me that it was exactly the right choice. Which is not to say it wasn't hard to leave. I still think about all the friendships and the people. So many of my law school classmates are still there. And I go, in fact, I'm going back next week to visit some friends in DC. So I miss it very much in some ways.
Well, those are hard moves, but you went to the SG's office in Texas. You were the deputy. And why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because this also is, I would say, a comparatively new thing. The archetype of the Washington lawyer has been around for a long time. Clerk Clifford and others, probably going way back, maybe even toward the very beginning of the Republic, there were lawyers of that kind. But the attractiveness of the SG's office is, in fact, the very existence of SG offices in the states is a kind of a comparatively new thing, and we're seeing extremely talented people go into these offices. So it's something to know about.
Yeah. No, the state, it's absolutely true. It was not something I had really thought about. I give all of the credit for my openness to this idea to Ernie Young. He was my Fed courts professor. He was visiting at that school in New England. The year, I can't remember if it was my second year or third year, but sometime when I was sort of up the end of law school. And I remember he said in our Fed courts class, he was relaying some story from Justice O'Connor. And he told us that Justice O'Connor often said that the most ill-served constituency in the Supreme Court of the United States are the states, right? And obviously she had a rich career prior to joining the Supreme Court in Arizona, and so she obviously has a very rich perspective about what the states and how they're represented in these circumstances. And she said, look, if you think about it, like the United States has obviously the Department of Justice. We've created and spent a lot of money, she would say, on federal public defenders and those sorts of offices to help for indigent defense, which is not to say that there aren't problems there too and that we don't need to do more, but just to say that there is some kind of structure to support it. Obviously, private counsel takes care of the private bar, but the states really don't have, she would say, back in the 80s or whenever, they just don't have that. And so I remember Professor Young mentioning that to us, and I remember him saying, this is the thing that gave rise to the state solicitor general's offices, was to try to fix that problem. And I'll tell you, it was a wild ride to be in the SG's office, because the state SG's office, because you just, it's sort of loosely modeled on the way that the United States does it, but obviously with far fewer resources, far fewer attorneys. And so kind of like on a shoestring. But the idea is roughly the same. And it's amazing because as a consequence, you end up doing, one day you have a criminal case, the next day you have a civil case, the day after that you've got some kind of crazy regulatory problem, and it's just every single thing. You have to become a generalist real fast.
So you argued probably in the Texas courts a great deal.
I actually, see, this is the thing is, as an immigrant I waved into the Texas bar. I was not as good. I've gotten better over the years, but when I first got here, I was not as good at dealing with the sort of the Texas rules of civil procedure and that sort of stuff. I just wasn't as adept at it. So I spent most of my time in federal court. And so I argued, obviously in federal district courts, I argued in the Fifth Circuit, and then twice in front of Justice Alito, which was surreal.
How was that?
It was surreal. It was the other thing that was so surreal about it was Justice Kagan was there. She was my law school dean. And so I remember very distinctly, I can't go back and listen to the audio. It just, I don't know, it just seems weird to try to do it. But I have this very distinct memory for one of these arguments. She had asked me a question and I looked over and I started to say, I agreed, Justice Kagan. I look at her and I thought, oh, that's my dean. But of course she was not. So it's really odd because you spend, when you're clerking, obviously you spend a ton of time in that courtroom. You have a certain perspective because you're always sitting in the same spot. and even when you walk around in there, when there's no one in there, it's really hard to kind of get a sense of what it's going to feel like with whatever 200 sets of eyes on your back, the courtroom completely packed, all of the justices there. Everyone always says that you don't quite understand how close they are to you until you stand on the podium. But it's true. I mean, they feel as close to me as the computer screen does.
That's a great experience. So you also you went from that office to being legal counsel to Governor Abbott, and what was your portfolio with the governor?
Golly, everything. It was it's so funny. The general counsel job, especially in a state of this size, is because I used to talk to other general counsels, to other governors across the country. And I get the sense that they're all a little bit different. I think I get the sense that even within the same state, the job is different depending on the principal. But it's crazy because of the breadth of it. I mean, I guess that seems to be a theme I hadn't really thought about it until you and I started talking about it. But each one of these jobs has just the most unbelievable range of issues, right? I mean, we would have all kinds of crazy things that would happen in a given day because if you think about it, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people who work in Texas state government. Each of the various departments have lawyers, obviously, but they almost by default turn to the governor's office when they have questions, when they are looking for guidance, when something's going wrong, when they're in trouble, and whatever. And so there seems to always be an emergency. There seems to always be a problem, but you have no idea where it is. And while you're dealing with one problem at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, there's a separate problem at the Texas Department of Public Safety. And then, oh my goodness, we've got a toll road problem at the Texas Department of Transportation. It's just constant sort of fire management. The governor's office itself has, I think, 400 employees. That's just the governor's office, to say nothing of all of its supervisory role. And so, it's kind of like, I guess, being general counsel of a conglomerate, maybe, right? Because you've got a bunch of little companies but these aren't really little. It's a bunch of different companies that are separate, but all under the big umbrella of the Texas government. And then, of course, the best part of it was working for the governor and that relationship.
You were not, or were you involved in judicial nominations for the
state level?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't. It's kind of yes and no. So yes, I was involved. We did. The governor has an appointments office, and I have forgotten the numbers. It's a lot. How many appointments the governor makes in a year. But we don't have, like in the Texas Constitution, it's not like the United States Constitution where vacancies give rise to appointments and confirmation. Almost everything is elected. So the appointments are for vacancies that only serve until the next general election. But there's still a ton of them. And a lot of appointments are to things that are not like full-time positions. So it'd be kind of boards and commissions and that kind of thing. But yeah, I did a lot of work on the Texas state, whether it's judiciary, we did DA's offices, the various, obviously the lower courts, family courts, that kind of thing. And it was really interesting. Yeah.
I can imagine that the people who hold these jobs across the country now are becoming experts on COVID, and there are these issues around religious services and trying to have restrictions that are fair across the board, that make sense. And a lot of these things are being challenged in court. There are a lot of lawsuits. So it must be a very hectic time for people who are the legal advisor to governors, but it seems like a great opportunity to be involved in things that are really important right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine what it would be like to do it now, because I mean, when I was there, we had Hurricane Harvey, massive hurricane that decimated Houston, Texas, and that created all kinds of legal, practical, problems, like massive emergency declarations to try to deal with the cleanup and the evacuations, and so that was a huge deal. But it only lasted for I don't know. I don't think it lasted 6 months, as I recall. I mean, obviously the emergency itself was sort of confined in that moment, and it was horrible in that moment. And our hearts, everyone's heart was breaking for the people of Houston, and we spent a ton of time down there trying to deal with it. But it didn't go on forever, and it wasn't the entire state. And so the things that they're dealing with now are obviously a different order of magnitude.
They're very tough, I know. Well, so you had this experience in the state. You'd been a federal guy, now you're a state guy, and then the pendulum swung back again, and you get appointed to the federal bench. And you and I have talked about the fact that students often want to know, gee, how do you become a judge? And there are a lot of different routes, and you're just what any reflections that you have on this? It came to you at a fairly early point in your life. Did you welcome it? Was the timing perfect? In general, how did this happen?
Yeah. Oh gosh, where to start with that one? So how do you become a judge? Let's start with that. So I used to ask that to Judge Sentelle, because when I was clerking for him, I can't say that I wanted to be a federal judge. What I would have said is, this is the greatest year I could possibly imagine ever experiencing in the practice of this chosen profession of ours. I just can't imagine it will get better. And I would have said the same thing about my term with Justice Alito. It's there's no way to top it. And so the only thing that I guess would be second to clerking would be, as I call myself sometimes, being the fifth law clerk. That is the one who has to make the decisions and sign the orders. And so I used to ask that to him. And so he would tell me about his story. Justice Alito's told me about his story. I look around, I'm one of 17 on our court, and I look around, and everyone has these radically different paths to the bench, right? There's no right way to do it. Some people come up, I have some colleagues who were state court judges before, for example. I have some who came straight from private practice. That's a route. I have some who were who are federal prosecutors. That's a different route, through the U.S. attorney's offices. I have some who have come through political offices, various kinds, state and federal. And so it's just I don't think there is any right or wrong path. If it is something that you want to do. The two things I would say is, one, I don't even know if it makes sense to say I want to become a judge for any number of reasons, right? It's because the circumstances that have to line up to have it work are so, there's so many different things, right? It would be like I don't do slot machines, but the 7 jackpot thing, I'm talking about. It's you have to have all the sevens in a row. In order to hit it. And that has really, some of it has nothing to do with whether you're smart or accomplished or going to be a good judge, right? There's just all kinds of things that have to line up for it to work. And there are all kinds of people who would have been great at the job. And for whatever reason, it didn't work for them personally or whatever. So I don't even know if it makes sense to ask the question that I always asked too. The thing that I would say, and the thing that was my kind of mantra for my entire career, I hope it still is today, is I always thought, look, God put us on this earth for a predetermined period of time that neither you nor I know, right? And no matter how smart you are, and no matter how rich you are, and how accomplished you are, and how many fancy degrees you have, you both will never know when your time is up, and you will never know how much time you've got. You just know it's set. And so with the set finite period of time, what do you want to do with your life and your career and the gifts that God has given you to make the greatest impact, to have the most fulfilling career you possibly can in our profession? It's part of the reason I immigrated to Texas. I really thought that there was a bigger thing for me than being in Washington, D.C. And I try to think about that every single day. I try to impart that into my law clerks, and when they're thinking about their careers, if the thing that you really are called to be doing is to be in private practice, and then you absolutely should be doing that. And if the thing you're called to do is public service, you should be doing that. And you're going to be much more effective for yourself, for your clients, for whatever it is you're doing, whatever case you're working on, if you genuinely feel fulfilled in it. And if you don't, you really ought to ask yourself the hard question about whether you need to do something different. Which I will testify is very hard. It's very hard to raise your hand and get off the train.
It is. I was 39, I think, when I became a U.S. district judge. And I can remember that when I got the call, well, at least the first call, which came from the senator in California, who told me he was nominating me to the president, was Senator Pete Wilson. And he said, you know, you're kind of young and you might not want to do this at this point. He said, on the other hand, this may be your only opportunity to do it. You know, you can't see the future, just what you said. And so if this is something you think you want to do, then I hope you'll do it. And I didn't hesitate. I thought that was extraordinarily good advice. On the other hand, it is true that you wouldn't, I think, maybe you'll agree with this, maybe you won't. We wouldn't want a bench only of people in their late 30s or early 40s. We do think there's something to life experience and that sort of thing, and legal experience. And so, but we see the presidents have been appointing younger and younger and younger, and I'm wondering, and you're young, which is good. You know, you have a lot of energy and passion for the job, and you bring your own perspective. But any thoughts on that? You know, because go.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I had meant to mention that earlier, is that you and I were the same age. I was 39 when I was appointed. And although I think I was 38 when the whole thing started, it was.
Yeah, I think I was too. Just want to be clear about that.
It takes a while, as this whole thing, as you know. But no, I also agree with that too. I think one of the things is the greatest part about this job, and I'm not sure what the, when I talk to my friends who are on the district benches, it seems like their experiences are different in the sense that they don't have, they're making decisions in their courtroom alone. They obviously have relationships with other judges in their courthouses, which I'm sure you did as well. But one of the things I love is, since I never do anything, well, virtually never do anything alone, right? Almost all of it involves a colleague or two or 16. I love, it's the greatest thing in the whole world to call and talk and think things through, learn about the institutional knowledge they have about the way this court has been operating for 20 or more years, perspectives that they have from their previous lives. There's an extraordinary amount of I think richness in the diversity of experience, different generations. And, one of my, I think I'm still the youngest judge on our court, and the oldest judge on our court, Tom Reevely, is almost my grandfather's age. Right. And so
Tom Reevely is amazing.
Breathtaking.
Breathtaking.
Absolutely breathtaking. I got to meet him by the grace of God in his chambers in Houston, I think last year, and I got a picture with him because I was so honored and proud. He, like my grandfather, fought in World War II, and it's just awesome to be able to share a bench with him. And on the same time, just think about how much amazing the amount of time that separates the two of us on the two sort of bookends of age, and how much the wealth of experience, the numbers of cases, the different movements the country's been through between his life and mine. And so I would think that they would be much poorer without having, if we were all Tom Reevely's or all me, you know what I mean? We need it's the variegation of it that makes it so great.
You started down a path that I'd like to follow a little bit, which is the experience of being an appellate judge. Sometimes people describe it as it's like the loneliest job in the world, and you have to like that. Somebody once told me that they were considering being on the federal circuit, and they were told that, well, if you're on the federal circuit, you could die in your chair and nobody would find you literally for weeks because just nobody goes in and out. And the person said, I think I really might like that. And I said, well, I don't know, that wouldn't appeal to me. A district court, you're on your own as the district judge, but you're constantly engaged with lawyers, with the bar. So it's very collegial in that sense. Although they're not your colleagues, but you know what I mean. I mean, we're all sort of colleagues in making the system work. And you do have judges who you can call and say, gee, a juror just did this. I have no idea. I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
So what's it like on the appellate court? Would you describe this as it's a group of individual law offices, or is it really, a group of judges kind of working together over time?
Yeah, when I first started, the administrative office described it as 17 siloed law firm offices, right? That, like, this is my little law firm with my law clerks, my JA, and me, and we're responsible for our little work product. And I suppose that's kind of true in a sense. And I would also agree that it's also true that it is quite isolating in the sense that for those of us who just are addicted to law, complete law dorks, all I want to do all day, every day is study it, think about it, argue about it, write about it, debate it with people. It's isolating in the sense I can't really talk about what I'm doing, right? And it's a little bit difficult to talk about what I'm thinking outside of the case and controversy requirement in Article 3. And so in that sense, it's isolating, and my poor law clerks have to get a whole lot of it from me, right? Because I can't put it anywhere else. So I do agree with that. On the other hand, one of the greatest things about this job is I get to do stuff like this. I get to hang out with you. And it's awesome. I get to go to visit law schools. I've loved teaching. I've taught, I can't remember, 3 or 4 semesters now since I've been here at various schools, and go do J-term courses in January and travel and give talks about topics that I find interesting that I could have never done before because I just wouldn't have had the time. I would have had some, I can't agree to come give a talk at Duke and then have to cancel it the day before because a hurricane hit Houston. And so it's just it's emancipating in that sense. And I get a ton of interaction with people that way. And I actually kind of find that truly life-giving. So I think it's definitely true that it's isolating, but we also, I do get to deal with my colleagues a lot, even on phone or email. And I get to do stuff like this.
Well, that's a great answer. Let's talk about your chamber staff, how you're organized, and sort of how, let's say, a real case that's going to eventuate in an opinion that you write, how that moves through the process as you see it.
Yeah. So I have 4 clerks and a secretary, her judicial assistant, because she's way more than that. I don't even know. She's out on vacation this week, and it's a miracle I'm even on Zoom with you because I can't figure out how to turn on the lights without her. So it's the 6 of us here. And when a case comes in, Gina, my JA, will take it, and usually she'll assign it to a law clerk, or the law clerks will divvy it up themselves. And I like to have sort of one law clerk who I refer to as the quarterback, right, who's sort of quarterbacking that case. But I'm a very firm believer in the idea that 2 brains are better than 1 and 3 brains are better than 2. And so I love as much kind of interaction, bouncing around of ideas, preferably clashing of ideas. There's nothing that makes me happier than I constantly have my door open because I love listening to my law clerks talk. And I love hearing them say, well, I don't know, not sure we have jurisdiction, or whatever it is, that they're going to fight about. But when they disagree with each other, that's the real crucible of I think, cogent legal thought. If we all just sort of agree, I've always thought that's kind of dangerous, right? Because then we're not examining the premises, really rolling an idea around. And then I will work, but I usually work directly with the quarterback and whoever else is working on it to try to come up with an opinion. I tell my law clerks, I want you to have the same experience that I did when I was clerking. I want it to be as rich as possible. I didn't get to work, draft every first draft of every opinion in the cases that I was working on, but I want my law clerks to have that experience because I want them to get both to have a chance to sort of stretch their legs or flex their muscles or whatever, but also to then work through with me with the art of the writing, right? So much of it is art when we're trying to communicate an idea. We're trying to communicate a judgment. And that's an incredibly sensitive and delicate thing. And there's just nothing in the whole world more invigorating than participating in it. So I try to do not that I don't want to do them all on my own. I quite frankly love doing them. But I like to delegate as much of it to them as I possibly can for the sake of their enrichment, their experience, and the iterative process of working together to make it perfect.
So could we delve into the nitty gritty here just for a second, if you're comfortable with that? And probably all circuits are a little bit different, but let's say that it's a case that where the panel, maybe the panel has decided, or the senior judge on the panel has decided that there will be oral argument. So we're not dealing with cases where, let's say, the staff of the court has prepared an opinion already, it doesn't raise any real question. But it's a case that may have some difficult legal questions. And am I right that before oral argument, you don't know if the case will be actually assigned to you, or is that different in the fifth?
No, we don't know until we vote. Actually, we don't even know at the end of the sitting, who's going to be the assignment. So the presiding judge makes the assignments, and we do it. So we'll have a sitting that lasts a week. Even when we're doing them on Zoom, we'll have a sitting that lasts a week. And then at the end of the sitting, the presiding judge will go through and say there's 20 cases, and we'll go, all right, I'm going to assign this one to Judge Levi, and this one to Judge Oldham, and this one to whoever.
And so what your law clerks will have done for you to that point, perhaps is to have written a bench memo and to help you get ready for oral argument?
Yeah, that's right. I asked him to, we brief everything, or memo everything, whatever you want to call it. I asked my law clerks to look at every case. It doesn't matter how, there's certain areas of law that I know better than others, but it doesn't matter. I treat them all the same. My theory has always been that as soon as you get comfortable and you think you know what you're doing is when you're going to screw it up. And the only mistakes I want to make are the ones that I thought about, right? Like I'm trying really hard not to make an unexamined mistake. Those are the ones that keep me up at night. If I look at it and I think it's orange instead it's red, like, okay, at least I tried, right? We're all frail. We're all human. We're going to screw it up. But I do not ever want to screw it up for lack of effort, energy, focus, attention.
Yeah. I think we call those unforced errors.
Yeah.
You don't want to make too many of those.
No, I want mine to be forced. I want to do it on purpose.
So the law clerk reads the briefs, writes a bench memo, and I'm sure you read everything. And then what is your sort of approach to oral argument?
Mm-hmm. So what I'll do is I try to read everything a week ahead of time. And then in the a couple days before argument, I sit down with the law clerk, who's the quarterback, and we go through the case. And I say, okay, let's kind of fixate on the flex points. Like, where do we think the weak points are in the various arguments, and who gets the long and the short end of this battle. And then I try to come up with a series of questions, but I don't really write them down. I really just kind of get into my brain kind of the broad pictures and the themes. So I think that in this case, there's going to be a personal jurisdiction problem. It's not completely obvious to me that there was purposeful availment or whatever it is we're going to talk about. And so I will sort of naturally in the argument itself just look for an opportunity to talk about that. I try really hard not to just like inject it into throw the grenade into the middle of the room. Because I really think it should be, this is my own, when I was an advocate, I kind of want it to be a conversation like you and I are having, and not just some like, nothing more sort of unnatural than that.
Well, and I think the point, and I can tell you that you're going to agree with what I'm about to say, it's not an occasion where the judge has any need to show everybody how smart the judge is. It's really the lawyer's time and your time to, if you've got some things you're uncertain about, which often a judge's goes into oral argument. You kind of think you know where you're going, but you're maybe not sure about all the pieces of the argument, and it's useful.
Well, and as you know, I mean, you had to make these tough choices too. Someone's going to lose, right? Maybe both sides lose, but someone's going to be more unhappy than the other. It's such a rare case where both people walk away 50-50, like, Solomon or whatever. I mean, it's really hard. And so I always think about the fact, since someone's going to lose, we really owe it. We owe it to both sides. We owe it to the law, but we in particular owe it to the one who's going to lose, that we really take it seriously, make sure that we're right about that. And to, as you say, it's the lawyer's time to try to save the case or to rehabilitate the case or to militate the loss. And so I think that's just a sign of respect to the bar and also to the client.
So we do have some questions, and I better ask them before we run out of time. And I can tell that we've got some people on the program in the audience who are thinking about, gee, it'd be great to clerk for you. So one question is, do you like your law clerks to have had a year or two of experience before they come to you, or do you care? How do you see that?
Well, let me say first, although my dad, like Judge Sentelle, went to the University of North Carolina, and I can sing the Tar Heel Fight song, I do love Duke. And my first year on the bench, I had a Duke law clerk, and she was amazing. So I would love to have applicants from Duke. It makes me so happy.
Wonderful.
I know people, I know professors there. I know you, obviously. And so I have people I know and I trust there. So I feel very comfortable hiring. So I'd love to have more Dukies. How do I sort of think, were you saying, how do I sort of think about the clerk hiring process?
Well, yeah, I think particularly because some judges now want their clerks to have worked in private practice for, a couple of years.
No, my view, I have no preference one way or the other. I have clerks who are straight through. I have clerks who have clerked for other judges before me. I have clerks who are going to clerk for me and then another judge. I have clerks who came from private practice. I've got all kinds of clerks. And I think the thing from my perspective, I try to make each clerk class round, right? So I don't want 4 people straight out. I don't want 4 people who've had a year out. I try to have sort of a variety of different perspectives because, people who come straight through, they have a handle on all kinds of stuff in law school. They think about these problems the way I used to think about them. Obviously, when you're a 3L in law school, that means you know a lot about the law review literature. You are probably an articles editor on your law journal, so like the sort of ideas that are in circulation. That's a great skill, but it's different than someone who's been at a law firm for a year and knows the difference between 12b-6 and Rule 56 in practice, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, here's a question from someone who has figured out that, gee, you'd be a great mentor, and they want to know what advice do you have for a 1L?
Oh, that's a great question. So I hate to say this. I hate it because I'm not really a grade snob. I don't have like some sort of weird arbitrary GPA cutoff or whatever. But I would say, particularly your 1L year, to focus as much as you can on getting the highest marks that you can, because it really does matter for all kinds of things. Each one of these incremental steps in your career builds on the one that immediately preceded it. And so I think the best thing you can do as a 1L is to really focus on your classes and to really take it as seriously as you possibly can and keep your marks up as high as you can, because it's going to set you up for success for each of the next, down the road.
And I think you'd agree that, not everybody comes out of college ready for let's just say, the unique experience of the law school exam. And so I think employers, including judges, like to see people who maybe it was a little rough their first semester, but you can tell every semester after that, they're getting it. They're yeah.
I like that.
One more question, and then we're really at the witching hour. You've lived in a lot of different communities. How do you see how would you compare that, these different communities, or how important is it to be in a community that resonates with you?
You mean geographically?
Geographically, yeah.
Yeah. So I can't imagine anything more important. One of the greatest things I love about Austin is that I mean, it is a little bit of everything. In some ways, it's like a little bit of every one of the various places that I have lived. It's not quite the Anglophilia of living in Cambridge, England. That's its own thing. But, we have, obviously the University of Texas is here. So it has that, which I'm sure you would sympathize to. It's a little bit like Triangle. It's got a ton of the sort of the intellectual vigor of a higher education. It's got an art community. Obviously, this is the music capital. We call it the music capital of the world. Nashville disagrees with us, but there's a ton of the sort of artist community. There's tech and all kinds of the sort of vibrancy that comes from that. And it just makes it, so it reminds me a lot of living in Northern Virginia, right? We have professionals, we have all kinds, it's just an incredible melting pot. And it's always resonated with me because obviously it's a little bit weird by design and proudly, but I just think it's life affirming to be in a place that really sort of supports you in that way and makes you feel like there's a little bit of all the things you find important.
We could talk for hours, and I hope sometime we'll have that opportunity in person.
Oh, it'd be great.
It would be wonderful to welcome you to Duke, actually at Duke, but we're so grateful to you for being our judge in residence this week. I know you're going to be meeting with other student groups, and you're going to a class, and that's really wonderful. And it's so helpful to our students to hear about your experiences and some of the career decisions that you made. What stands out to me is this mix of public and private, state and federal, and your willingness to try new things, because I think that's important. You even moved across the country to do so, even though you told Justice Alito you were from Texas, where you would go to Texas. We can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for
It's my great joy.
being with us here today. This has been Judgment Calls, a program of the Bolch Judicial Institute. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you, Judge Oldham.
Thank you so much.